I was president of ARP, and I can't tell you what an experience was to get the first production unit from Korg. It came to my house, and my kids helped me open it. They're about the age I was at the time I designed this thing. And I opened the box. It was really like being in a time warp, because here was this thing that at one time had just been a sheet of paper on my desk with a bunch of pencil marks as I was trying to get the flow of the panel worked out and so forth. And so it was quite an experience, and I have to say I've been a serial entrepreneur ever since starting ARP. My sixth company is a public company called Carbonite that does backup for computers. But this business really launched me, and this is my first time I've been at a NAMM show since 1979. So I need to be back. They asked me to talk a little bit about sort of the history of ARP, so I rooted through my scrapbook that luckily my wife kept, and put together a few things that I hope you'll enjoy seeing. It's sort of a remembrance of ARP and how the Odyssey came to be and what came before it. So, I was a student at Yale. I had a double major in music and engineering, doing composing. And as a bursary job to earn a little extra money, I actually designed and built the Yale Electronic Music Studio, which you can see me here. This is a write-up of me in the Yale Alumni magazine from sometime in 1969. And at that time, electronic music was pretty much avant-garde composition, and it was almost entirely centered around universities and composers who luckily had tenure so that they didn't have to worry about whether anybody wanted to listen to their music. Anyway, I went on from Yale to Princeton, where I was doing graduate work in engineering, having discovered that I was never going to survive as a composer. And I get a call from trying to keep myself out of Vietnam, and I get a call from this guy, Al Perlman, whose lawyer had seen this write-up in the Yale Alumni magazine. And Al said, I want to start a company to make synthesizers, and you're interested in coming up and talking to me. And just at that really serendipitous moment, those of you who are old enough to remember the Vietnam War, they came up with this brilliant idea of taking all 365 days of the year and pulling them out of a hat. And if you got in the lower third, you were off to the NAMM. If you were in the middle, you might be off to the NAMM. And if you were in the last third, you were safe. And I was lucky to have a high number. So my wife and I packed the cats and the Christmas tree and all our other worldly goods in my 1961 Corvair and headed off to Boston to help Al start ARP. Al was a really great analog designer and had actually had a company that made very specialized analog circuits before getting into synthesizers. We were not the first synthesizer company out there. Moog had been around since, I think, mid-1960s or a little earlier, and in fact, prior to starting ARP, there had been this famous record, Switched on Bach, with Walter Carlos. But Moog's drifted out of tune, and Al, being a really good circuit designer, and I know the guys from Korg encountered this in trying to learn how all this stuff worked. It's very difficult to keep analog circuits from drifting out of tune, and that's a sort of picture of an early diagram of an oscillator. But keyboards generate a linear voltage, 1 volt, 2 volts, 3 volts, but 1 octave, 2 octaves, 3 octaves is a multiplier. It's 2x, 4x, 8x, and so forth in frequency. And luckily, there's a characteristic of transistors that says if you put in a voltage that goes linearly across the base to emitter junction, the current going through the transistor will go up exponentially. The problem is it's extremely temperature sensitive. So trying to figure out how to compensate for that drift that normally happens when you just even breathe on an analog synthesizer, keep the pitch from going crazy, was a very daunting task, and Al figured out how to do this, and ARP had a couple patents on that. And then you can see up in the upper corner there was one of the early encapsulated filters. To keep all these parts at the same temperature, we actually put them in a cup, filled the cup with epoxy, and potted the whole thing. And then, the copper shield is because what you heard the Korg guys talking about. They're very sensitive to all kinds of interference and so forth, so you had to shield them as well. Anyway, this was all the technology that went into it. And we also came up with this idea of eliminating patch cords, because I'm sure everybody here in the room has seen pictures of the old Moog synthesizers that predated ARP, and they were, you know, just this mass of patch cords, and we decided to use these matrix switches as a way to actually do a patch and, with these much smaller modules. So anyway, we were 5 or 6 engineers sitting around building this thing for about a year, and we finally got it done. And then we all looked at each other and said, well, you know, now we're just about out of money. What are we going to do? Somebody's got to go sell this thing. And I, being the only one who had even the semblance of a liberal education, was elected to go out and sell it. So I dragged this thing down to Yale, and we sold the very first one to Yale, and then we sold another one to Brandeis, and then my wife's alma mater, Sarah Lawrence, and so forth. So that all the early ones tended to go to universities. And then a funny thing happened. We started to see big name rock musicians come and knock on our door and say, I want to buy one of these too. And there's me with George Harrison from the Beatles, I think probably about 1971, something like that. And then Jimmy Page showed up, and he wanted one also, and there's his early ARP 2500. And they started to use the sounds from these early synthesizers on their records. And the next thing you know, we start to get more and more calls from rock bands who said, how did George Harrison make that sound, or how did Jimmy Page make that sound? And you know, the bad news was these things were expensive. I mean, 10,000 bucks in 1971 was a lot of money. And so you had to be this level of musician to be able to afford one. But having a kind of a commercial, if we could make these things cheap enough and inexpensive enough, we could sell these things to every rock band. And that's when we came up with the idea for the ARP 2600. And they're the very first ARP 2600. It was not really a good stage instrument because it was in kind of 2 boxes, and it didn't really have a carrying case. It was kind of fragile. So and by the way, my wife is a graphic artist, and she designed that original ARP logo that you see over here and everything with a treble clef. Then we moved to a sort of a built-in carrying case where the whole thing folded up, and that actually became very popular. And next step, we said, well, how do we sell it? You know, you could take a $10,000 synthesizer. It was worth sending a salesman out to call on some big rock musician who could afford one. But when it's only 2,000 bucks, you couldn't do that. So we said, let's try selling these through music retail stores. Why not? So I made the first, what I believe is the first sales call of a synthesizer manufacturer on a retail music store, which was Manny's Music on 48th Street. And I won't repeat what was said, but the end result was that my ass was deposited back on 48th Street. So I went next door to Sam Ash Music and tried again, and they said, sure, you know, we'll try it, we'll take one. Well, 2 days later it was sold, and they called up and said, we want 3 more. So we sent them 3 more, and a week later, and then Manny's calls up and says, I hope you didn't take offense. And long story short, Manny's ultimately became the largest ARP dealer in the world, probably by creating a gray market throughout Asia and South America. The next thing that sort of dawned on me was, okay, so we can get these things into retail music stores. How do we get all those high school rock bands to want to do this? And you know, it was a pretty simple leap to come to the conclusion that high school rock bands will buy whatever their heroes are playing on. So, you know, if Stevie Wonder were going to have a hit tune on an ARP synthesizer, everybody go buy an ARP. If Emerson, Lake and Palmer had a hit, they'd go and buy a Moog. And so I said, you know what, I'm going to spend the next 5 years running around signing up every rock band in the world that I can possibly do. And for years, I would literally get up 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and I'd go down to some recording studio, typically either in LA or New York, and I'd wait. And generally around 1 in the morning, the band would finally show up. And if they were not too drunk or too stoned to see the piece of paper that I had in front of them, I could get them to sign up as an artist endorser. Now, we didn't have the money to pay people to be endorsees, and I have to say, of the hundreds of, over 100 bands that we signed up over the next 5 years, we didn't give one of them a free instrument. They all bought them, but what we did give them was we worked with them. We gave them a lot of love, and we took care of them wherever they went, anywhere in the world. If there was a problem, they could call me personally. And believe me, I got a lot of calls at 3 in the morning. Steely Dan is in Bangkok and their synthesizer died. What do they do? Well, I could get the dealer in Bangkok to get up and go down there and swap out the old one for the dead one for a new one, and send me the bill, and I'll give you, $500 or $1,000 for your trouble. And they loved that, and that's what we did for our artists, and it worked great for many years. So we ended up doing, those of you who are old enough to remember this era, in Rolling Stone, there were always a lot of ARP ads and Keyboard Magazine and many, many other places. And we just had lots and lots of endorsees, and it was great. And then I said, well, the 2600's been successful. What can we do to make it even more of a stage instrument? Let's forget about the educational market. And that's when we said, let's make the first synthesizer with really no patch chords at all, where everything, we now know what kind of patches people will make if they have patch chords, so let's embed those in an instrument. And that's where the idea for the Odyssey came. And you'll see one of the differences, this is probably the first one or one of the first ones. The pitch bending was done with a knob, and a subsequent innovation that I brought in was the idea of these little touch pads that when you press on them, bend the note sharp or bend the note flat and add vibrato. And so this one even predates the models that the Korg guys, asked me, should we go back to this very original one? I said, no, there is such thing as progress, and we did, in fact, make some progress with that. And we introduced the Odyssey in 1973 right here at the NAMM Show, and we had a number of bands, and we played in the grand ballroom of one of the hotels here. I can't remember which one it was, and it was packed. But it was a wild time to be in the music industry. Even the roadies had roadies. And unlike now, there was a lot of money in the music industry back then. And it was great. It was a lot of fun. And I had this craziness in my life for about 10 years. This was the factory. We just started cranking out these Odysseys. It was a big hit, and we made them as fast as we possibly could. And there's more things from the NAMM Show, but we did a lot of what is being done here today. We had actual performances up on stage, and we brought in a lot of name musicians. And I would measure my success by how many times could I hear an ARP synthesizer on my car radio between leaving home and getting to the factory. So flash forward 40 years, and here I am opening up the box from Korg, and the time warp completes. I was one very happy dude to see that. Thank you, Korg. It's been a real pleasure to be here. Thank you.